All right, here we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Establishing New Populations and Ex situ Conservation. And this picture is from a botanical garden taken out of your book. So there's different programs for establishing populations of a extinct or endangered species. There's reintroductions. That's where we release individuals into their historic range, something that might have gone locally extinct. There's plenty of examples of this with wolves that were hunted to extinction in the Rocky Mountains and much of the contiguous 48 states, and then they took populations that were existing and reintroduced them into other areas. In Alaska, we have a really great example of this with wood bison, especially in western Alaska. There was a recently re-released wood bison herd, and these species went locally extinct. There's historical record of them, and I really encourage you to look it up on the Department of Fish and Game's website. They had oral history of the last ones that had ever been seen in the wild, and it was taken by a hunter who didn't really know what it was. Then they had wood bison populations, though, that were in northern Canada that were still pure, genetically pure. Wood bison have a huge issue with being crossed with cattle, and then the diseases that go with those. And then if they get crossed with buffalo as well, there's diseases. But these were pure. They then took some of them, put them down into the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center that's in Portage, Alaska, and raised them up there, and eventually got the funding and the effort together to take them out into western Alaska into some suitable habitat, and they seem to be thriving there and mixing in with the ecosystem quite well. There's also reinforcement programs. These release individuals into existing populations. Some examples of this that are poignant are cheetahs. Cheetahs have a notoriously low genetic diversity, and so taking individuals from zoos, conservation centers, or just other populations that have a larger local population and introducing those individuals into an existing population can help with their genetics. Sea turtles are really heavily predated upon in when they first hatch, and they're predated upon by really common species like seagulls. So taking and digging up those sea turtle eggs can actually, and then incubating them and releasing them into the wild, is sort of a way of reinforcing those things in the wild. But taking them from either a captive or some sort of breeding program and then releasing them into these live populations. Other examples come from California condors and whooping cranes. There's huge breeding programs with them, and releasing those individuals into the wild can help them get from babies to fledging. There's also conservation introduction. This one's a little more controversial. It's also been known as assisted migration. It seems like the terminology's moved to conservation introduction, but this is where we take a species, we move that species to an area outside of its historic range. And we do that because its present range is no longer suitable for it, whether it's because of habitat loss or oftentimes because of climate change. And the example I'm going to follow through a lot of this when we talk about conservation introduction and translocating species is yellow cedar. It's a species of tree that's in southeast Alaska and British Columbia that's on decline due to climate change. It needs snowpack to cover the ground because its roots are really sensitive to cold temperatures, and as the snowpack's diminished with climate change and become less reliable, they have a yellow cedar decline, as it's called, because at first they didn't really fully understand why these yellow cedars were declining. And so there's been some talk of moving these tree species north in other areas where the coastal temperate rainforests exist, and because they have more reliable snow coverage in those areas. This, though, to go back to that gray wolf reintroductions into the northern Rocky Mountains, is an image from the book. There's a lot of controversy that can come about with reintroductions, and we'll touch on some of the other ones, but I wanted to kind of focus on the predator one for now. You know, as wolves, many of you know, they were shot nearly to extinction to protect cattle and sheep and other livestock, and as well as by just for recreational hunting. And so there was lots of concern about the wolves being reintroduced and basically livestock being decimated. And what you can see from this graphic is that the number of livestock killed definitely kind of came up and has gone back down a bit to their pre or right after introduction levels, and that's because of practices that people can employ to keep these wolves at bay. But there's a lot of issues that come about with that and controversy, and you see that with state and federal laws that kind of don't necessarily jive with hunting regulations and things like that to kind of lower the wolf population. But at the same time, do recognize that we need to have good ways of managing this, whether or not it's deterrence or controlling the population enough, especially when they start to interact with urban agricultural resources and areas to keep conflicts from occurring. So it's a constant push-pull. It's also been really good for the ecosystems there to have these species back. There's plenty of other examples of reintroduction programs, especially from captive breeding. Black-footed ferrets, another good one to look up. They were they were thought to be extinct and then found on one farm in Wyoming, and then reintroduced into the wild via a captive breeding program. These can be extremely difficult, though, because they have to do, there's a lot of hard things about raising these animals, but then also needing to raise them in an environment where they don't become habituated to people. And so there's plenty of these other examples out there, like the Iberian lynx in both Spain and Portugal. So the IUCN has come up with some guidelines for translocation of a species. This, again, is when we take a species from its existing range and move it to a more suitable area, whether it's due to climate or just loss of habitat. The graphic on the right shows the range in gray of the yellow cedar that I mentioned, and you can see that extends from British Columbia up into southeast Alaska, and the only places that it exists in Oregon and Washington. The Pacific Northwest is right there in the Cascade Range where they get the reliable snow cover. And what's happened is that because it's a really commercially viable species of tree and commercially important, but on a general decline due to climate change, so which may impact its status as a species on IUCN red lists, etc. later on. They've explored and talked about some ideas of moving it further north, because our coastal temperate rainforests extend as far north as Girdwood in Alaska, and so there's been some native groups that have explored trying to plant these trees in areas south of Homer, where the climate is similar to that of southeast, but the snow coverage is more reliable. The guidelines from the IUCN really point out that in order to do things like this, the threats need to be addressed. That species needs to be sufficiently understood. So how it interacts, those two things go together. And so we need to understand how it interacts in the environment, what it might predate upon, what diseases come with it, what needs it has, so that we can understand that species needs, but also what kind of threats it might have to other species that are out there. And thinking of trying not to make something an invasive species accidentally. We also need to understand the genetics of the species. What is its presence and optimal genetic diversity, and how do we manage that? Because we often, if we're going to be translocating something, we may very well need to bring up enough species in order to maintain that genetic diversity, but also to may have to hold those captive for some time. We need to know that there's enough habitat, that we've talked about the ecological risks. Those are some of the threats that I previously discussed. And then human concerns as well. And we talked about that a bit with predators. When they reintroduced bison into western Alaska, they did extensive interviews and surveys with locals to see if people would be supportive of these populations, because they can be kind of a nuisance, and in other places in the state like Delta Junction, where they were have an established population, they are often a nuisance for farmers, as they're aggressive towards farmers and mat down and eat the barley they try to grow. And then the last one on here is that it needs to be possible to remove all the individuals if the negative impacts we find actually outweigh the positive impacts of introducing that species. So if we find out that this could actually become an invasive species and it starts to prey upon or compete against another species that's threatened or endangered, being able to remove all those individuals so we don't have any negative impacts is really important. For yellow cedar, I don't think that much of that would actually be an issue. Not likely to have any huge things, but probably looking at some of the diseases and things like that that might carry, and screening for those would be something pretty important. So there's some distinct challenges for animals and plants, and some of the differences that come in there. Both of them share the issues of needing to maintain the genetics, figuring out how to breed them, what a viable population is for breeding is, and how to do that both in captivity and how it successfully happens in the wild. The big one for animals is needing to manage their behavior and over adaptation to humans. And so here, this California condor chick is being fed by a puppet to basically reduce that human imprint on that California condor. And you really have to pay attention to the human imprint because that can be particularly dangerous for these species when they're reintroduced. You may have read about in the book that the species of bear was reintroduced into Europe, but they were habituated to their handlers and then became problems. And as we all know, in Alaska, bears habituated to people or problems were breaking into houses, cabins, eating chickens, etc. And so they was not successful. Same thing could happen with condors and other things. If they get too used to people, they can seek out food in the human habitats rather than in the wild habitats where they belong. Plants, though, the thing that differs big time with them is that they need to be put into the exact suitable habitat. We can release something like a California condor in the general range in an area like a cliff where it's able to fly away. Those are some of the famous things you'll probably be able to find if you Googled California condor reintroduction and watch a video on it. But plants, we can't just disperse the seeds over the entire area because oftentimes we don't have that much of those seeds anyway. So we actually need to figure out where they need to be, where we can plant them, and where they need to be planted in order for them to be most successful if we're going to introduce them in the wild. So we have to know a lot about the microsites and what it takes for those plants to thrive. So there's in situ and ex situ methods. They can kind of go together sometimes, but also, and we'll talk about that a bit more with animals. But we need to be able to compare what might be an in situ versus ex situ methods of conservation. We'll use yellow cedar as an example in this. So in situ is on site or on the original range. So what we might do in Alaska and British Columbia to maintain the yellow cedars is limiting logging in those ideal areas where they still get that snow coverage that protects those roots. And then study their genetics and the pathways, what moves their seeds around, how would their seeds move around naturally between these different areas and mountain ranges and other spots where they thrive. And so in situ conservation really involves trying to remove our pressure on that species, that human pressure on the species, and then studying the species in its natural environment. That then feeds into ex situ, which is off-site habitat or out of the original habitat conservation. If we understand what it needs in the wild, we can then establish a species like yellow cedar in arboretums or botanical gardens and maintain individuals there, get them around to different places that way so that we have some genetic stock to work with, similar to what happened with the wood bison. Those populations of wood bison, they will always keep some captive in order to maintain those kind of pure genetics. And from that, we can then determine, where to translocate these species off-site or out of the original habitat into areas that would make sense if the risks are also addressed. So this model from the book shows ways in which in situ and ex situ conservation efforts can benefit each other. No species is actually going to follow all of this flow chart exactly, but in ex situ conservation, we gain things like storage of sperm, eggs, tissues, seeds, knowing that genetics, having a stock to work from if we can reintroduce them later. They're present in zoos, aquariums, botanic gardens, seed storage facilities, and can work in establishing breeding populations. In situ conservation then needs to have protection and management and monitoring, but those zoos and aquariums, they can learn a lot of the ways to do that with scientists, veterinary care, and agricultural management in a botanical garden that can then help us with the management of those in the wild if say a plant disease or insect outbreak were to happen that started to decimate a plant population. We may already know from growing these things in an arboretum or a botanical garden how to manage those pests for this now this now wild population that's being impacted. We can also take these collections from the wild and move them back and forth between ex situ and in situ populations. Basically take a collection from the wild, bring it into a zoo, bring up some of the genetics, putting individuals back into the wild from those zoo breeding programs to then boost and reinforce again that population. But ex situ alone is not sufficient. I mean, these species, they're ecologically extinct if they're not out in the wild, and it also it can really reduce the natural behavior of these species and can be a real issue for their reintroduction, especially as they learn bad habits like human habituation, and the like. Also, they could have physiological and morphological changes as we take and do breeding programs. We kind of put these things in a genetic bottleneck and we try to manage that with good mixing of their genetics. But we start with such a low population to begin with that physiological and morphological changes could happen. They don't have the same pressures of the natural environment that they lived in as they're being raised in a zoo or aquarium or botanic garden. And then also managing diseases. We have captive animals. Diseases can run rampant through those and be a really big problem. And this graphic shows the Chinese giant salamander. And salamanders and amphibians in general are really one of the species that was on a big decline, as we saw in previous chapters. And so their number of captive threatened, vulnerable, and endangered amphibians has really been going on the rise in recent years as we're trying to get those populations and bring them into these programs. So these species or these programs, ex situ programs in garden zoos, conservation centers, help us understand the biology and physiology of the species. Big one is developing those veterinary interventions that can then be transferred out into the wild, and then preserving that genetic variation for reintroductions. But another big one we really haven't talked about is educating the public, and especially for charismatic species and the less charismatic species too. If we can educate the public and bring in some appreciation for those species, then it actually can really help a long ways with the conservation, whether that's through political action or donations to conservation practices. But it gets to be a very big bonus to conservation efforts in general, because it all comes down to the way we vote and the way we purchase the products, and what we as a worldwide community do and appreciate as to what is conserved. And here's just some images of botanic gardens. People appreciate botanical gardens everywhere. And for the beauty that they bring and showing that off that diversity, but they also have a really big impact and benefit towards conservation of species in general. And this is a seed bank. there's a really huge and nice one in Svalbard that but they in seed banks, what we're doing is storing seeds and storing some of that genetic diversity, especially from the past, with seeds and agricultural seeds in particular. And in some areas, when we start to reproduce these different agricultural plants, they lose their genetic diversity. In other areas, they maintain it, but these seeds and cataloging them and storing them can allow us to study, understand, and maybe even bring back some of that genetic diversity when it's needed. And this is some maps of where genetic diversity is still high for some of these plants, and usually where that is where those plants originated from in agricultural areas. So think of like the potatoes in South America, beans, and then tomatoes in the Mexico area, wheat, which originated in southern Europe and northern Africa, is most genetically diverse in those areas still. And so those areas where these plants originated from tend to still maintain a lot of that genetic diversity, but as we move them off of those sites, they can we have to make them more suitable for those to being domesticated somewhere else, and don't necessarily maintain as much of that diversity. There are some methods of de-extinction. There's some programs for something called backbreeding, and so where we use relatives of an extinct species to selectively breed morphologically and ecologically similar species. The big example of this is this quagga, which is bred from a zebra. Quaggas are actually a subspecies of the zebra. They are distinct from zebras based on their morphology. They lack the stripes on their hind end and have some distinct changes in their midsection towards what those stripes look like. And there's a quagga project that has sought to basically reintroduce and recreate these quaggas from zebras through breeding programs. The next two we'll talk about are mostly theoretical in the sense that they may have tried them, but they haven't really been truly successful yet. The first one's cloning. That's where we use a nucleus of a cell and insert it into the cell of a close relative. This can be really difficult, especially because there's a lot of basically weird mutations and defects that often come out of clones. We've successfully cloned some animals. You may have remembered the famous sheep that was cloned back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But when we start to talk about cloning with a threatened or endangered species, we're starting with a population that is already getting into a genetic bottleneck. And so that can make it extremely difficult to make a cloning project actually work. Genomic reconstruction is another one that's really theoretical, and it's possible to take genes from an extinct species if you have recent genetics material from that, because genetic material is going to degrade over time, and you insert it into the genome of a living species. And so you've all, if you've seen the movie Jurassic Park, this is what they're talking about here, this genomic reconstruction. You wouldn't, that's what's shown in this image down the bottom right, you wouldn't be able to take the DNA from a mosquito, the blood in a mosquito that was trapped in amber, because that DNA degrades over time. But the general idea that they did, where they took DNA from that they had stored somehow and then put it into a similar species and then raised it up to be this other thing, is what genomic reconstruction could possibly do. It's entirely theoretical and would introduce a whole lot of issues with having quality genetics to actually work with. There's a lot of debate about de-extinction, whether or not we should even do it. The big one is being, what if habitat no longer exists for that species? Whether that's due to climate change or simply habitat loss, where would we actually put it besides a zoo or some other captive place? Zoos would be great because we can appreciate that animal, but it's still ecologically extinct if we don't actually get it established in the wild. And then we don't know if all these former characteristics and behaviors will actually return. So we don't fully understand if it's, and can't predict if it's actually going to behave in the wild as we thought it did previously. And will they actually function then the same as that extinct species ecologically? And another big ones is, will these efforts kind of discourage real conservation efforts? If we're able to bring back the black rhino and put it into zoos through one of these practices, then is that going to discourage people from doing real conservation with elephants and the remaining white rhinos? And then will that funding also for this actually divert from funds away from real conservation? Real conservation is when we take a species and an ecosystem approach, combine those things together, and we're able to actually benefit not just that species but the entire ecosystem that's around it, and those ecosystem functions that benefit us as well. And so if we start to divert funding away from that type of conservation for some of these theoretical ones that bring a species back that's already gone, it's debatable if that's actually a good use of the money versus trying to do on the ground conservation.